All right, good evening. I think we'll kick off and let the stragglers keep popping into the room. My name is Danielle Cave and I'm the Deputy Head of the International Cyber Policy Centre here at ASPI. It's fantastic to see such a busy room this evening for what is a research project that is towards the more technical end of the spectrum of topics we tend to cover. And a topic that is not always accessible to policymakers, but that at a basic level, I think will soon be expected and assumed knowledge for parliamentarians and senior policymakers across a whole range of departments and agencies. This evening, we're here to launch the latest paper out from our International Cyber Policy Centre, authored by non-resident fellow Rajiv Shah, titled Protecting Critical National Infrastructure in an Era of IT and OT Convergence. This research publication was supported by Thales Australia, and we're very grateful for the ongoing support that Thales Australia has shown the Cyber Centre over the past few years. This paper looks at what a collision of our digital and physical worlds means for critical national infrastructure providers across the sectors that keep our lights on, keep us healthy, keep us semi-warm in Canberra's hideous winters, sectors like energy, health and electricity. When you read Rajiv's paper, you'll see he points out a range of policy gaps in this space, and he's laid out a host of well-thought-out recommendations how these new and evolving risks can be managed going forward, and we'll debate those later on. He's going to give us a 10 to 15 minute rundown of the key takeaways of his research publication. And then Rajiv and I will be joined by Rachel Falk, who is the CEO of the Australian Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre, and Jeremy Hulls, who is the General Manager, Critical Infrastructure and Cybersecurity at Thales Australia. I'll fire off a couple questions at them and then we'll open it up for, I think, quite a long Q&A so we can get questions and thoughts from the floor. And as we continue to debate Rajiv's paper, we will then head to canapes and wine, which I think is the best way to do that. And before I introduce Rajiv, I'm going to steal 3 minutes of this evening's event because it's a good opportunity to take stock of where our International Cyber Policy Centre is at the moment. It's mid-year and a lot has changed with the Cyber Centre over the past year. This is the 4th policy paper we've put out this year. Others have looked at Australian digital diplomacy, at electoral interference and the hacking of democracies, and we've mapped out the global expansion of some of China's technology and telecommunications giants. We've hired a number of new analysts this year with a really broad range of skills and backgrounds. We've had the former head of NSA, Mike Rogers, out as our 2019 Cyber Fellow. We've held the Australia-US 1.5-track dialogue in San Francisco, and we're planning a number of bilateral dialogues this year with a whole host of countries across Asia. We've hosted a range of different free and paid events and different conferences, and parts of our team have become completely swamped by international media and foreign government requests for interviews and briefings on 5G and, of course, Huawei. We're now building up a new program of work on information warfare and influence operations. We're doing more and more work on critical technologies like 5G to try to help policymakers and politicians prepare for both the opportunities and the policy challenges that these technologies will increasingly bring. Our China analysts, who focus on original empirical research using Chinese language translation and new data sets that we create ourselves, continue to produce ASPI's most read publications. And this research has really found a global audience this year, as I've learnt as I've gone on trips in Europe and in the US. And last month I was in the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore and was really surprised to find out how much that work is being read across Southeast Asia. And importantly, our mostly behind-the-scenes cyber capacity building and training program now works all over the world, with a focus on the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia, led by my colleague Bart, who is currently talking about cyber norms and the value of a free and open and secure cyberspace in Fiji right now. And we are also working to try to do more on topics that we think are important, and we'd always love feedback on this. We're trying to do more on India, on the technical and policy implications of smart cities, on the technical and policy implications of artificial intelligence, and on the impact of technology on human rights around the world. So there's a huge amount going on upstairs in our offices, and we're delighted that we have a growing cohort of stakeholders across government, industry and civil society interested in our work. And now back to why we're here, and to introduce Rajiv. He's worked in the cyber, intelligence and security business for over 20 years, where he's held a broad range of leadership roles with major multinational companies before starting his own consultancies. Importantly, he also has a PhD in quantum physics, making him one of 4 people in Australia who actually can explain what quantum is. Maybe we'll get to that in the Q&A. Rajiv, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for taking the time to come and listen this evening. I should point out that PhD was done far more years ago than I care to count, so don't ask me too many detailed questions about it. But so what is this going to do was just sort of give you a bit of an overview around the paper. And, you know, I do have a technical background, I did do a PhD, and I was quite careful. I thought I'll try and make sure this is untechnical as possible. And I picked up the paper this morning and had a read of it and thought, actually, that title looks quite complicated. Maybe there's a few things I ought to start off by just trying to explain what we really mean in the title. So it's probably worth me defining a few terms. This is the scientist coming at me. You know, so first of all, you know, what is critical infrastructure? I'll put the definition up there. That's actually the official Australian government definition of critical infrastructure. You could say it quite simply, it's something that if it broke down, we'd be in serious trouble. That's what critical infrastructure is. It's the stuff that's key to our way of life and everyday activities. Then what are the other acronyms? So IT, information technology, that's something we're all familiar with. That's, you know, your computers, your laptops, your smartphones, all those things that we're now used to using to process information. And then the other thing that's in there is OT. Now, this is a term that's sort of becoming more commonly used, but this is operational technology. And traditionally, you know, people had their IT systems, their computer systems, their office, their billing, whatever, their email. And then they had operational technology systems. Operational technology systems then were the things that controlled the power plant, controlled the water treatment plant, things like that. And they were completely separate. And often they were very simple systems. They were sort of, you know, what we call stovepipe systems, simple end-to-end systems. You know, you had a sensor here, a control system there, and a button you press there, and that was the system. But that's now changing, and that's therefore what we want to talk about, therefore, is around convergence. And what we're saying is that actually those distinctions between, well, this is our IT system, that's our OT system, they're not connected, they don't have anything to do with each other, that's all changing. Those are starting to come together. And therefore what we're starting to see is what we might call cyber-physical systems. So systems that are high technology, interconnected systems that actually then have physical impacts. So therefore, you know, by pressing something here or something happening or this bit changing over here actually makes a significant physical consequence in a system that's working. Why would we do this? You know, it's actually someone said that to me earlier. Why do we bother? Well, you know, this is the way that society is going. We look at this across society. Digital transformation is the word on everyone's lips. And what that can do is that can actually bring significant benefits. You know, we all want to be able to generate power more efficiently. We want to reduce waste. We want to make sure it's cheaper. You know, all these things, digital transformation can allow us to achieve that. If we start to bring our IT and OT systems together, it means that we can make better decisions around how we control plants, how we do that, how companies price energy to you, for example. All of these things. So there are all these benefits that are there. So, you know, so it's this whole story that if we can get data out there, we can use it to make better decisions, and ultimately we can get better outcomes from that. We're also seeing that there are now multi-vendor systems. You know, I said traditionally you might have had your system all from one vendor who sold you their end-to-end control system. Now what we're seeing is that you have multiple different systems that interoperate and work with each other, because then they can be more effective, because if you know what's going on over here, it can help you inform how you control this system here. So we're getting that, and then, you know, you don't have to look very far. You see trends like 5G networks starting to be rolled out, the Internet of Things. The opportunities there are growing, and therefore the significant forces that are saying, well, actually, we can connect these things together, we can get our IT and OT working together, ultimately we can work more effectively, more cheaply, more effectively, better. So there are benefits, but there are also risks, you know, and these are not new. If you actually look back, almost back to the turn of the millennium, back in 2001, here in Australia, there was an incident with Maroochy Water Company in the Sunshine Coast. And that was where you had a disgruntled employee. He got fired by the water company. He wasn't happy about it. He'd still kept a laptop and a cable and a few bits and pieces. He was able to actually hack into the sewage treatment plants, and he was able to release untreated raw sewage into freshwater systems, into the freshwater supply. That was, as I say, 17 years ago, a long time ago. So it's not new, but it hadn't happened, and, you know, because we didn't have that, that did require a specialist thing. That required, you know, an ex-employer with insider knowledge, specific equipment, and so on. But if you look at some of the more recent examples, probably the one that brought this to public consciousness for most people that you talk to is the Stuxnet attack, for example. That was an example there of actually what was in theory an air-gapped system. You know, it was a nuclear processing plant. It was completely cut off. It didn't have any external connectivity. But someone was able to attack it, allegedly by using a USB key. Leave a USB key lying around, someone plugs it into a computer, that gets the infection onto the system. And that then allowed a state actor to go and sabotage the Iranian centrifugal processing. More recently, again, then you see things like activities that Russia has done, for example, in the Ukraine. And in fact, in the last few months, you'll have probably seen some stories around how the United States has said that Russia has actually been in there in the US power supply. And that's an interesting example if you look at the details of that, because that's where actually what the Russians did was they went in first into some of the suppliers to those electricity companies, and then were able to move across from the supply networks into the power company networks. And if you've also seen probably in the last couple of weeks, there's been some speculation that, the US has obviously got upset by this, and therefore said, well, actually, we're now going to start penetrating and getting a presence in Russian power company networks. So potentially some quite significant escalation going on there. So just to summarize, so convergence is there. These systems are starting to come together. There are benefits to doing it. There are also risks to that. And therefore, that's the balance that we think needs to be thought of. So this is where I get vaguely technical. There you go. There's the technical instructions. But just to sort of talk about, because, actually, if we look at this, as an introduction, I've worked in this area for 20-odd years, and we've made significant advances in IT security and information security over the last few years. We've got much better at it. And a lot of that does read across, but there are things that are different about how you're trying to secure an OT system. Now, one of the most overused phrases in management jargon is the 80-20 rule. This is a slightly different one here, because what you could say is actually, when it comes to IT and OT security, probably 80% overlaps and is the same. But actually that 20% that's different is what makes it difficult, what makes it different, what means that all the stuff that you think solves your cyber problems doesn't necessarily solve your OT security problems. So just run through a few of those differences. So one thing actually is just what I call the risk calculus. The impact can be much more significant. The impact of losing large amounts of personal or confidential data can be big. But the impact of, for example, if you were able to affect the processing of a power plant and cause a massive explosion or something like that, that can be a much bigger, much more significant impact, and that may therefore affect your trade-off of what probability of risk you're prepared to accept. Then we look at things like the lifetimes of these systems. We typically replace, people nowadays are replacing their phones every couple of years. An industrial control system often has a lifetime of 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And that means that, you can't just go and expect that the vendor may not be around, for example, to keep supporting it. It may be designed and have hard-coded features in there. You look at some of those old systems, they probably didn't have any passwords, for example, because they just assumed that you needed physical access to the system to be able to control it. So trying to keep those up to date. In cybersecurity now, we say a lot of the large significant amount of the problems can be avoided by good cyber hygiene. One of those key things, for example, is making sure you keep your passwords changed regularly, that you make sure your systems are patched and kept up to date. Those sort of remedies don't necessarily work in an operational technology world. And then also if we look at the priorities, and this is there's a good cartoon here, right? But what do you do in a cyber attack when all your data is being stolen? You just pull all the cables out, right? If you can't do anything else, and disconnect the system. That's not necessarily an option. And if you sort of look, those of you that were here a few minutes early, you'd see we were all actually waiting to see if this computer rebooted itself in time for us to start the presentation. And that was all right, because we could laugh, because we could just sit here and I could talk without these slides. But if that's you, and you're driving across a bridge and suddenly it stops in an open position because the system needs to reboot or load an operating system patch, clearly that's not an option. So that priority that, when we looked at information security, generally confidentiality of the system was the most important thing. In operational technology world, it's actually about the availability of the system and the integrity of the system that can be most important. And then this really comes down to ultimately the threats are different. The way that people would attack these systems and the impact of that and how you can find that is different. You can have all your wonderful artificial intelligence, machine learning systems that go and detect the indicators of a cyber attack on an information technology system. They might completely miss an operational technology attack. You say, well, actually, I'm going to put a firewall in here. A firewall is going to protect my web server and my email server and things like that. So if I put a firewall in my networks and protect my IoT system, it probably won't, because the way the firewall is set up and what it allows through and what it doesn't allow through will not necessarily stop someone trying to attack your operational technology system. So these are some of the differences that we need to worry about. So that was my technical bit. I'll try and get off that. Okay, so for the course of this paper, I actually went and talked to a wide range of people. And one of the key questions we're trying to understand is, what is the real state of maturity here? Because, as I say, these risks are perhaps nothing new. They are understood. But what is the maturity in terms of how people are handling them? And the sort of things we said, actually, when we went and talked to people, yes, they said the risks are well recognized. We do have to be more careful with an operational technology system and what we connect it to, because we know the impacts can be greater. But actually, when you sort of drill down to it, well, what are you doing about it? Generally, the comments that came back is there are problems around the board level visibility. Is it actually something that the boards are sitting there worrying about? Again, roll back a few years ago in the IT world, people used to say, well, cybersecurity is the IT department's problem. No one says that anymore. Everyone says cybersecurity is a board level issue. But is OT security a board level issue? I think the answer to that is not yet. And that's something that's needed. And that's what's needed, is it needs to have that visibility and it needs to have that support in order to be given the priority. Then you start to sort of drill into it. And people say, well, yes, we know we've got a problem, but we don't really have a good understanding about what the vulnerabilities of our systems are. We don't necessarily regularly test them the way we test our IT systems. And when it comes down to incident response, when was the last time that you went and tested your incident response plan and practiced for an attack like this? Actually, the answer to that was often sort of people sort of looking around and say, well, it's been a while, or we wrote the plan and we haven't actually had a chance to test it out yet. So definitely there are issues there. So what is it? What can be done? And I think one of the things that we sort of feel is that actually people aren't necessarily confident in knowing what the answers are. So we can get into this in the discussion around how we think this can be addressed. But if I just sort of summarise some of the suggestions that would come forward. First one, it comes back to my point. It needs to come from leadership at a board level. So whether we need to encourage, we need to compel, we need to cajole boards, we need to make sure that boards are taking this seriously. Boards are setting the right culture and expectations through an organisation. That this is actually, this is part of, in the same way that, things like cybersecurity, things like occupational health and safety, this is one of those things that a board can't afford to ignore. It has to be part of the culture through the organisation that people go and think about, well, if I connect A to B, what risk am I taking? What am I doing to mitigate that? Is that a sensible trade-off to make? And therefore, the next step is therefore making sure that actually there is a really clear understanding of the risks. And I don't mean people saying, yes, we know it's a bit risky and we need to be careful about it, but people actually thinking about understanding through standard risk management of this is what might happen, this is the consequence, this is the probability of it happening, this is what I can do to mitigate it, and either I'm going to accept or I'm not going to accept that risk-benefit trade-off. This is what we call setting the right risk appetite at a board level. And then how do we make sure that people are able to get the right answers? The cybersecurity skill shortage is well understood. A lot of things being talked about that. A lot of programs now being stood up by the Cybersecurity Growth Centre and other people around how we train a workforce. But have we really thought about how we train a workforce that understands OT security? So we make sure we get those courses in place. How do we make sure that actually throughout an organisation people start to understand things like, yes, actually you might think this system is secure, but it's not, because if you go and plug a USB you found in the car park in there, then that's probably a bad idea. Those sort of things. And also, how do we make sure that we get the IT and the OT people working together? I think this is actually quite an important point, and it comes back to what I started, which is, traditionally we're very separate disciplines. And now they're coming together. But still, you sort of talk to people and say, well, yes, we have an IT team and we have an OT team, and yes, we get together once every quarter or something and we have a chat with each other. But people think of them as separate problems, whereas they're not. They're combined problems. You've got to bring people with skills and experience in both sides of that in order to address them. A few other things. So, regulation. I think there was something here where we may need to go and compel organisations. I mean, one of the things I didn't sort of say earlier on is when you go and look at critical infrastructure, yes, it's a very broad area, and it's sort of broad different types of organisations. You can have things from your small local council out in the region somewhere that's operating water treatment plants through to large multinational companies, and therefore the different public-private ownership, different scale, different resources they have available. So how do we help them in terms of providing standards that they can sign up to and they can certify themselves again? And where there's a need for compulsion, what regulation is needed from government. But it's not just about forcing, it's also about collaboration. And again, this is something we might want to talk about more in the discussion, is how do we get good, effective collaboration? So those of you who may have heard Admiral Mike Rogers, when he was out here, he was talking about there ought to be better real-time collaboration between critical infrastructure providers and government. So if in a government system there's some identification of some threat intelligence information, that gets fed in real time, not sort of 6 months later, here's some indicators of compromise you might want to go and look at on your system. And how do we actually then make sure that we understand how to deal with these incidents? This comes out to a point, a lot of people tell you, yes, we've got a response plan, but we probably just cobbled it together. We haven't really used it. They need to be tested, and sometimes that's just a matter of doing some exercises, but actually doing through some war games and actually working through, not just at a level of individual organisations, but what is the impact on the nation and society as a whole if something like this happens? How do we react? How do we handle that? How does that get managed? Those are sort of things. So that's sort of my quick run through. I think we've sort of thrown it into a bit of discussion. All right?
Right.
Okay.
All right, thank you for that. I'm going to quickly introduce two other panellists. So Rachel in the middle here is, as I said, the CEO of the Cybersecurity CRC, which focuses on delivering research with impact and solving industry-led cybersecurity problems. So good to have you on the panel. Rachel also comes to the CRC with a strong commercial and cybersecurity background, having practiced as a lawyer for 15 years, both in leading law firms and in-house at Telstra. Jeremy over here took up the position of General Manager, Critical Infrastructure and Cybersecurity for Thales Australia in 2015. And the CIC unit, the Critical Infrastructure and Cybersecurity unit, is responsible for ensuring cybersecurity within Thales's own critical business unit external projects, as well as facilitating customers who wish to implement leading-edge cybersecurity capability into their own existing systems. That was quite a long sentence. I should have put punctuations in there. Rachel, I'm going to go to you first, but this is a question for the whole panel. So to me, it sounds like getting OT cybersecurity right is critically important. Your paper convinced me of that. It seems like a really easy sell. But I'm struck by the fact that it sounds like 99.9% of people don't know what IT cybersecurity is. And I feel like if I walked around the halls, for example, here in Canberra, with the exception of the Australian Signals Directorate, including the Australian Cybersecurity Centre and IT and cybersecurity sections of government departments, I think 9 out of 10 people would have no idea what the acronym OT stands for. So I want to know why that is, if it's so critically important.
That's a really good question. To be honest with you, I think you're absolutely right. And I've got a pretty simple, not diminishing the fine work, but to me, if it's connected to the internet, it's at risk. So we start on that basis. So I agree. I must admit, when I read the paper, I was thinking IT, OT, the average person probably wouldn't get the difference. I think it's just important to remember they're all systems connected to the internet, and they all pose a risk, and they all need to be maintained. It seems to me, though, OT has slightly different maintenance schedule and a slightly different requirements given the nature of what it does. And as we saw with Stuxnet, even an air-gapped system can be at risk because of human behaviour. So it seems to me that it's probably for the average person, and certainly the average board, it's not whether it's IT or OT, it's about what risk do those systems carry, and what do I need to know as a board member or a director or a CEO about the maintenance schedule, or how much money in a budget should I be devoting to ensuring that that system functions for us, is not legacy to the point where it becomes a huge risk. And also, what does it do? Does it still do, or do I still need it? And what are best practice sort of products in the market that could really minimise the risk and harm from those systems not being not maintained? Okay.
So Jeremy, what about you? Why aren't organisations, whether they're industry or government, more advanced and mature in this space than they are IT security?
I think there's a couple of aspects. One is cybersecurity has matured over the last few years from a awareness perspective. So having been in the industry for 20 or 30 odd years, I won't say how long, it's taken a while to come to the fore. So there is a momentum there. OT security, and it was said in the opening address, it was handled as a separate group. It was a different function. So you were putting in OT capability, you weren't necessarily in the IT, and the two groups didn't match. The other factor is OT has traditionally been a safety critical component. And so when you've got a safety critical component, there is a natural resistance for IT security because it's a resistor to openness in that. So there tends to be two factors. You've got two groups not necessarily talking. You've got the safety component you've got to address, and then you've also got the momentum of the industry. And there are going to be future elements that are going to be looked at as the industry continues to grow. So, Rachel's point, as soon as it's got an electrical pulse, it's at risk, literally. So, I think the industry's catching up. It's now what we do from this point forward that's the most critical.
Rajiv, I might skip that one for you, but go straight to some of your recommendations. What I want to know from you on that list is, what is the low-hanging fruit for critical infrastructure providers versus what you see as the difficult action areas? And I wondered if you two could also come in on that afterwards. You might want to add additional ones that you feel like were missed, or highlight ones that you thought are most important.
So I think one bit of low-hanging fruit would be around that education and awareness. As you say, maybe we need a better term than OT, right? But people need to understand that actually, if it's connected, and even if it's not directly connected, I think the other thing that people may not realise is that system is connected to that system is connected. That system is connected to the internet now, and the last step wasn't there 5 years ago, and people have forgotten that in that chain. So making sure that basic awareness and understanding is important. That's certainly a bit of low-hanging fruit, I think, and that sort of basic.
Everyone loves low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, just don't give us a e-learning course you have to go and click through all the time and find a better way of doing it. So that would be one. I think the one is not as low-hanging. I think it is around making sure that boards are empowered and encouraged to take this seriously. So whether that's about helping them to get some education, forcing them to report on it in the way that they're forced to report on things like cyber risks now, I think that's the other key one. Because, let's say we went and talked to some of the practitioners, people at a working level understand and recognise it, but often say they're not getting the senior support, the leadership, the prioritisation in terms of resources that they need, and that has to come from the top.
And what about difficult action areas?
Difficult action areas. I talked about trying to get better government and industry collaboration. That actually, if we can get that to work well, I think that can have a big impact, but that is an area fraught with all sorts of things, because there are issues around government systems, around classification, about things like that. There are also things about, there are genuine sort of public policy considerations about, do you really want, government intelligence people snooping around and messing around in private sector networks, those sort of things. And that's a really difficult problem to solve. And, it's actually been one that's been the heart of a lot of things I've done over the years, is how do you get government and industry to work effectively together? But if we can get that right, I think that can have a really big impact.
How about you, Rachel?
Look, I think I'd agree. I think the interesting thing is, you mentioned standards. I think I'm going to be a bit of a negative person around this. I think there can be a little, but I'm always controversial. It's really important to remember standards are great, but there's a tendency once you put out the thou shalt follow the 455 NIST requirements for something, that it becomes very complicated and people just work to the schedule. And then in working slavishly to the standards, actually don't realise they've left their operational security hanging out. So I'll always say standards don't equal compliance with security. Standards don't often always equal security. And the second point is, I think, also understanding what your system what your industrial control system, or say it's a water plant, what inherent risk does it bring? Because you also have got to focus where your board spends their time. For example, you don't want the board, because if you give them a standard and a dashboard, that's what they'll focus on in their board reports, and all the board will go to, why isn't this green? Why isn't this green? Why isn't this green? When a big risk for your water company could be integrity of results. And can someone access the water sample results and mess those up? Because they're going to give you a really bad day beyond whether your dashboard's red, green or amber. So it's about also waiting to the board and working out what is the more riskier of these environments if our system isn't secure versus we also need to be focusing on general cyber hygiene for whatever we secure by way of test results or important data about our operation. Because again, if the board's only got 45 minutes to an hour to devote to this every board meeting every quarter, you want to make sure that the focus is in the right places. And I just have found over the years, you give people a standard and then everyone becomes obsessed with the standard, which is really funny because it's a bit like PCI and other ones. You can get more points for having glossy policies on a folder on your desk than you can for patching. So you've got to be really careful around what you're going to help your board deliver in understanding the risk for your particular system, for your particular industry. So that's the real important thing. So it could be low-hanging fruit, so to speak, but it's a really important operational security point when you're wanting your board to focus and devote more money or more time or better understand the risks. Make sure all the risks are weighted appropriately, and the ones that are going to bite you may not be the ones around have we patched this little system over here or have we got this worked out, because if your test results aren't secure and you get a nation state who wants to give you a hard time, that's where they'd go.
And do you feel the same way in terms of difficult action areas being the industry government collaboration piece?
Yeah, I suppose so. I personally don't have much experience in this sort of area, but I don't actually find industry government. I think it's more around, again, the cautionary tale of, and I don't think your paper doesn't mention this, but again, I've read articles recently where there's this expectation that government will solve all the problems. Again, I think a lot of these utilities are privately owned with money. They really are expected to take the leads and not look to ASD or to others to simply have a magical wand they can wave to make it all better. Again, it is about, if it's a private entity, and most utilities are privately owned, then it's about devoting the time and attention and budget to minimising and effectively managing those risks. Absolutely bring in agencies when there's a major breach for guidance, but don't look to government to solve all your problems. Look for them for good guidance, but they can't just be the magical wand waver if it gets too hard.
Jeremy?
I'd agree. I think a structured approach is absolutely critical, and a lot of organisations look for the silver bullet. They look for, how am I going to fix it in one go? You're never going to solve cybersecurity in one go. It is a constantly evolving issue that has to be looked at. It's like safety. It's exactly the same approach. You've just got to be constantly vigilant and keep on top of it. The frameworks, yes, they give you a method, and I fully agree with following a method, but it's how you actually articulate it. So it's not just a matter of following the bouncing ball, it's the effort that you put into actually looking at your system and looking at the security. And I fully agree with the concept of people have to understand where do they want to be, what actions do they want to take, and start to take those actions. Because, look, it's a tough industry, right? You're going to get a lot of industry out there telling you that this product or this product or this product is going to solve all of your problems. And next year it will be the next product, and next year it will be the next product. If you don't structure how you actually fill your base of cybersecurity and start adding to do it in a sensible way, whilst always looking at your risk as an organisation, that is absolutely the fundamental point. Why go and block a hole if it's not a risk to your organisation? Understand what it is. An example, I was talking to the Aeronautical Society last week, and putting an example to them is, if I wanted to actually impact, a catastrophic impact, I'd look at something like a flight briefcase, because I can change that. We trust the algorithms we put in that, and we actually then put that into a plane and we take off. And if I change the algorithm, I can actually affect that. Now the nods around the room of that issue was a realisation. I'm not saying that they don't protect against this, I'm just saying it's that level of realisation of looking at the risk to what you do as a function, not just actually saying, well, I need to go and block the firewall over here, or I need to go and do that. So it's really thinking about that up front and giving yourself a plan of approach.
What do you want to come in on the piece about industry, government collaboration in this space? I mean, from your experience, you've been in industry for a long time. Is it really difficult to genuinely collaborate with governments, not just in Australia but around the world?
Look, it's always going to be an interesting one. I think Australia's done a great job over the last few years of actually bringing cybersecurity to the fore and bringing it as a real subject to follow. You've got two different entities here. You've got industry as a commercial entity. Its job is to, support its shareholders, etc. But we also have or many have a duty of care and an ethical obligation to what we do. For example, if you're building or working in engineering safety critical systems, you have that obligation as an industry as well. But we can always do more, but I agree. I think it's not up to government to fix all the problems. Government sits there and says, this is what we want to be as a country and how we want to do it. And then industry really should supplement that. Can we do more? Absolutely. Can we share more information? Absolutely. But I think the two are starting to work together. It's never going to be perfect. We're going to actually have to work on it, and different organisations are going to approach it in different ways. And I think the two are starting to work, but it just takes its time, which is normal.
All right, let's go to the floor for a bit of Q&A, and depending on how many questions there are, we could take a couple at the same time and then go back to our panel. If there are no questions, I will be picking on my ASPI colleagues, so they better come up with some questions, and I'm going to start with you, Tom. So we've got a question over here.
Thanks. Zoe Thompson, Accenture. I wanted to ask, thinking about critical infrastructure and thinking about the way that systems are related within Australia nationally, but also how they influence other systems internationally, what do you think about the position that, say, the CEO of a board of a major electricity supplier is in when they suffer a cybersecurity attack with OT outcomes that may be related more to Australia's position geostrategically, say with brokering and free trade agreement or something like that, than the company itself or any particular kind of lapse they may have had in security? I think that although it's hard to be sympathetic for companies that perhaps make a lot of money and are privately owned, we possibly also need to be sympathetic to the fact that they perhaps are facing risks that are not of their own making.
That's a great question. I think I saw somebody else around here in the middle. Oh, there you go. Hi, Mike.
Good evening. I was just wondering if you could discuss the parallels from critical national infrastructure just to any company. So you might remember, I think it's about 12 months ago, just steel needles in strawberries caused this entire angst in the food supply chain. So I don't know how the average Australian would feel if they couldn't have a beer on a state of origin night because someone had gone into that beer factory's OT and messed it up. So in terms of building this groundswell of knowledge and desire to fix problems, yes, critical infrastructure hits lots of people perhaps at once, but some of these other things could be very personal.
Do we have a third question before we go back to our panellists? No? All right, let's tackle those two, and then Tom, I'm coming back out to you. Oh, there is a third one.
So we've been talking about SCADA vulnerabilities for the last 15, 20 years. Will critical infrastructure always be low-hanging fruit for malicious attackers? Even if we improve security incrementally, is there anything we can or should do over the next 5, 10 years to take it out of the low-hanging fruit category?
All right. Rajiv, we're going to start with you and we'll go that way.
Okay, you can test my memory now, but we'll start off with so I think, you're right, you may have some element of sympathy about companies, but ultimately, and Rachel made this point, these are often private companies. They have to take responsibility for their outcomes. They're there to make money, but they also need to make sure they need to invest appropriately to secure the risks of their business. And if you sort of take it away from the specific example, I would have thought, any multinational company needs to be aware of the environment in which it's operating. If you're going somewhere where you're sending, a dangerous environment where you're sending your staff, you make sure you take precautions there and you provide security guards and secure accommodation for them. If you're going to go and operate in a country where you think there are geopolitical risks that mean that your systems may be exposed to a risk of cyber attack, then you need to take that into account in the priority and the measures you take to address your cyber risk in your systems, because you say, well, actually, that I need to not just worry about, the disgruntled employee, I need to worry about the state actor because of this geopolitical environment, because I've decided to operate in this country. It's part and parcel of doing business.
Question number 2, which was the parallels between critical national infrastructure and any company that Mike asked in the middle.
Yeah, so I think I want to try and do is sort of respond to the last 2 questions together in a way, because yes, we talked about critical infrastructure because we focused on critical infrastructure in the study because, coming back, it is the thing that is key to our way of life. But yes, actually, you could say having a beer on State of Origin life is pretty key and people will get pretty upset about it. And therefore, a lot of the parallels that we talk about here are not just applicable to the critical infrastructure, they're applicable to a whole range of organisations. And I think what I would say is, firstly, it comes back to that point, which is that I think there needs to be conscious decisions made about when people decide to go and connect physical systems to cyber systems, that they understand why they're doing it and the benefits they're going to get out of it outweigh the risks against that. And therefore, that also comes to your point, what can we do to make systems more secure? And a couple of examples about things that I came across. So one actually is Idaho National Lab in the US have basically a framework they set up called cyber consequence engineering, which you can boil it down to, which is saying that actually you don't connect things together unless you've got a really good reason to do so. If you go a bit beyond that, they actually say, well, you understand what you're doing. You may say, well, these are my crown jewels of my system. This might be my beer producing plant or the safe water system or the clean water system for my beer production. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that is a system that I'm never going to connect to anything that is internet connected because the risk of anything happening to it is far too big. My company would close down, my business would go away. The other thing is that they look about is things like, well, if you make a decision to connect something, maybe I've got this digital system, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to have some analog system as a backup, as a redundancy to that. So, if you look at some of the examples around these attacks, it's not just that someone will sabotage a system, but they also then sabotage the things that are supposed to monitor and raise an alarm. But there, if you then have separate analog monitoring systems that can tell you something's going wrong, then that gives you an extra level of protection. So that's one example of how we can get away from the low-hanging fruit, because this shouldn't be the easiest thing for someone to attack, is to go and attack our critical infrastructure, our SCADA systems. Another example, and I think it sort of comes up to what Jeremy said earlier on around the flight briefcases, but I think there's actually somewhere where we need to look at how we engineer a lot of our systems and the trust we place in them. How do we engineer a system where we can make sure that we can trust it, or if something gets compromised, it fails in a way that is safe? So again, take another example outside of this direct area, but the Boeing 737 MAX example. That's an example to me. It shows me we're a long way before we can have autonomous driving cars, because that's the system that's designed to make it easier for pilots and take over automatic certain functions. But what happened was when a sensor malfunctions in a particular way, the system actually makes this aircraft unsafe rather than safe. And therefore, we need to actually look at how we engineer systems so that we can trust them and that they're resilient to those sort of outcomes.
Rachel, that first one is perfect for you.
The first one. Look, I agree with Rajiv. I think if you do business in multiple jurisdictions, then you need to know the operating environment of those jurisdictions, and if it's more risky and you run SCADA systems and a complex plant in other jurisdictions, you have to guard against that, just as you would if you had a chocolate factory and you were and which didn't have a SCADA system. It's exactly that. It's the cost of doing business in multiple jurisdictions and most listed companies would run the appropriate checks and do due diligence before going into those environments. The second question, and sort of the third question as well, again, the strawberries example is a really good one because it's about even if it had just been one needle, it was the fear of sabotage. It was really sabotage. So all organisations, both if you're running a physical plant with strawberries or a completely cyber-enabled plant, it's the threat of sabotage, and all boards should be understanding where the threat of sabotage is for them, irrespective of it's an industrial control system or just their systems generally. I probably should add, though, a lot of critical infrastructure and segments is governed by legislation, certainly regulations around minimum data security standards. For example, there's new APRA regulation about cybersecurity. The telco sector is regulated by the Telecommunications Sector Security Act as reform as part of the omnibus legislation that went through. Similarly, AEMO, the energy regulator, has standards which I know that that they all work. All of the entities that fall under AEMO's regulation work very hard to ensure that they have those minimum standards. So it's not like it's the Wild West for critical infrastructure either. It might not be perfect, as Jeremy said, but there are a whole bunch of regulations that they all work to, and they are about ensuring there are minimum standards. So when there's low-hanging fruit, sure, some of them might be open because they're legacy, but just a lot of non-SCADA system environments also run on legacy, and we saw that with Equifax. For example, in the Equifax breach, it was a large organisation that had legacy pieces scattered across the US. So it's probably more about not just what control systems do you run and patch and make sure they're maintained, but what legacy do you have, and is your board aware of that? Because I can tell you that there's probably boards that don't know about legacy systems that are run. And in some places where I've worked, if you do surveys and you chase all the systems in an organisation, some of them don't even have owners. And some you don't even know if you switch them off what they'll do. And that's even worse if people are running, systems that have stopped being patched in 2003. So it's also about understanding your ecosystem and infrastructure and working out if something isn't patched and it's legacy, why do we even still have it on? And what'll happen if we switch it off? That's sort of actually more of a bigger risk. So it's about where does that system, the ICS system, sit within a broader structure. But you're absolutely right. It's the threat of not just the needles in the strawberries. It's also the threat of the integrity of data and whether the water samples are tampered with or something else. It's really the confidentiality, integrity and availability that is important in all systems, OT and IT, but getting them to converge and talk so that there's really a holistic threat scenario, and our threat analysis for a board is what's important. Is the board have everything they need to know so that when the ICS if it is compromised, the board doesn't go, what system? Did we even know that system existed? Because a lot of the hype and dazzle is around the stuff, and often people get distracted by what blockchain do we have and what's AI are we looking at and where's our next board visit to name interesting country. That will get a lot of attention, not the, boring, do we have to go through this 5-page report about our legacy? Really, who wants to do this? Isn't the CIO here to cover off on this part of it? So it's also about educating your board that you can't always look at dazzle, and it's not about razzle-dazzle. It's sometimes really boring to go through the boring trudge of the CISO's report or the CSO's report, because that is what good cyber hygiene looks like.
It's not all about artificial intelligence.
It isn't about AI, blockchain, dazzle hype. You can tweet that, Jess.
I agree. Going back to the first question, ownership is about the organisation itself. I'll give you an example of a few years ago. I was talking to a critical infrastructure industrial organisation. I won't go any further than that, so we don't share any names. But they were complaining, the risk manager was complaining about espionage from foreign state, a particular foreign state. And they did a lot of work in this place, and they went up there, and I said, so what do you do when your engineers come back? And they said, well, we just plug back into the network. So this was a large organisation, very simple thing, but this is about understanding. If you're going to go to these other areas, you have to then respect that you are targeted. I used to work for an organisation doing pen testing where whenever I touched down in a particular country, within a millisecond I had 1,000 attacks on the device, trying to actually get in. So these are the consequences that people don't think about when they do this sort of stuff. So that's important. I think, look, cybersecurity, as I said, is an ever-evolving piece, so there are going to be exceptions to that. There are going to be points when something has occurred that people don't know about, hence why there's such a patching regime, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to take it in context of what's actually occurring. So that's, I think it's a bit of, you've got to get the basics right. I mean, 2 years ago, 96% of vulnerabilities were still by, attacks were through 2 vulnerabilities from 2003 and 2006. So the basics have to be done for a start. On the question of other infrastructure, I agree. I think last year, Coles and Woolworths independently were both, their FPOS systems were down, people were at registers. The angst that causes, the chaos that causes is almost the same as not having beer on State of Origin night. So I think supply chain is the next piece. You talk about low-hanging fruit of OT systems. Supply chain is also critical because it is the soft entry point to most organisations. And that can be a soft entry point IT-wise, or it can be a soft entry point, could I manipulate the manufacturing of a crucial component that gets installed into critical infrastructure? So there are multiple areas that we should look at from that area. Low-hanging fruit, look, it's got to improve, but there's always going to be the next issue to solve. I wouldn't say it's always going to be low-hanging fruit, but there is always that vigilance that something is actually going to be fixed. And I fully agree about stopping looking at the glossy stuff. Just last week, very respected person in the cyber industry that I know was showing me a vendor's dashboard of the current real-time threats bouncing around the world and was so excited by it. How do you know it's true? There's trust. We're trusting these things. It just looks pretty.
Everyone loves some cyber pew-pew.
Exactly. So I fully agree with that sentiment. It's like get back to the reality of what you've got to do.
All right, let's go back to the floor for 2 more questions, and then we'll go to canapes and drinks. I'll take 1, 2, and if there's a third, you can probably sneak in there as well. 3.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I think this question is primarily for Rajiv. Sorry, Mick Lehman, Northrop Grumman, but welcome any other comments. And it's about what you were saying about the role of government, standards and frameworks. I think the most fascinating current play in terms of government frameworks is the way that the Therapeutic Goods Administration is looking at policy, went out for public consultation in December of last year, and watching that evolve in that very individually and the confidence that society has in networked IP-facing medical devices, and that's interesting to watch. But in regards to the role of government, there are 2 things that I didn't see in the paper in the time I had to scan. The first was in regards to audit. There's a series of Victorian Auditor General's Office reports into VicRail and the privately owned networks in Victoria, making observations about how that could be improved and what should be done. Do you see government in the same way that we set standards for food safety and audit the providers of food should perhaps have an audit function? And secondly, if you can't motivate industry in any other way, what about penalties? GDPR has penalties for data breach. We have similar penalties for data breaches in Australia under various federal regimes. So is there a time and a place where government says, if you don't live up to the standards that you've outlined, here are the fiscal, here is the impact on you for failing in that duty of trust?
There was one. Yep.
So my question is, critical national infrastructure, I think, includes social media as well, as it is used by large segment of the Australian population as the primary source of communication. So my question is, how do we balance the need for security on social media, especially with regards to encryption, with the demands for privacy?
All right. And there was one over here, I think.
There's been a lot of discussion of policies. I'm curious about workforce.
Could you speak up, or might not be on?
Is that better?
Yep.
Always helps if you turn it on. I'm curious about workforce because you can say perceptually, historically, that IT and OT in terms of management maintenance has been a white-collar industry versus a blue-collar industry. You could counterpoint that with the cyber industry as a no-collar industry, given their propensity for hoodies. But what does a converged workforce look like? Where do skills come from, particularly from the OT perspective? I'd probably throw that open to the floor.
Okay, so because of strict timing we have, everyone has about 2-ish minutes to cover off on those each, cover off on those questions. 2.5 is acceptable. You can leave one if your expertise lines up with another. Role of government, audits and penalties, including fiscal penalties, social media, online communications and encryption, and that third one on workforce. Let's change things up and start with you, Jeremy.
Very quickly then. On the audits and government, I'll take an example of the Mascot Towers in Sydney this week and the one before. There's a whole piece, I live in Sydney, but there's a whole piece around would it have happened if the building inspections had done as they should have been? We're rapidly putting up buildings and they're cracking. So to take that point, should we be auditing? I think it's a valid point that should be discussed at a government level. I think it creates a level of consistency about what's being done. Philosophically on social media, it's an interesting one. We could talk before canapes on that one. It depends on what you're trying to do. Cybersecurity it's the consequence of what occurs when a breach happens. I get that everybody wants their privacy. I get that everyone wants to communicate. And to be honest, not everyone's going to be happy with what the decisions are. But you have to balance the good of many for not so many. So it is a literal balance there. On the last one, I agree. The biggest thing that we see when you look at the convergence of IT, OT and physical security, which is coming together, is you've got multiple different disciplines and multiple different components to it. The biggest thing we're seeing is the people that can transverse between the two. Interestingly, we're getting a lot of capability coming from the OT side into cyber to start to transition the gap. I can tell you from experience, we work on a lot of safety critical projects, and the biggest gap is finding people that actually can converse to each other in the same language. So it is something that we're consciously working on, but it's, we've got to increase the numbers of workforce, not just in cyber, but in conversing between the two.
Right. On the audit function, I agree with Jeremy. I think it's a valid point around it always helps to have third-party certification as long as it's done right, and then it's not subbed. So again, you're getting some sort of factory farm of people who do it and just tick a box. However, regulation and penalties, interesting one. I am no fan of legislation where there's no bite in it. Don't have an act where there's fines but nobody enforces it. Don't have a regulator that doesn't want to enforce. A true regulator with effect and punch is one that is like the ACCC, enormous powers and they will use them. Regulations are only as effective as the regulators who seek to enforce them. So in my view, I think we should absolutely have a strong regulatory function like the ACCC for cybersecurity and similar breaches, with eye-watering penalties, but also with powers of compulsion to drag you down without a lawyer to sit in a room for a long time and answer questions, because that's what the ACCC has. No fan of that. Social media and privacy, now that's 2 minutes. Just quickly, the physical world has always had the right, there's always been an interception right, there always was under the Telecommunications Interception and Access Act. Most of you probably didn't know it. All products had to be interceptable. It is no different with the disruptors coming into the world and disrupting by having OTT applications. So in my view, there shouldn't be a reason why we have disruptors who present these new fabulous apps, but they're not subject to the rule of law or subject to interception under warrant, targeted, limited period of time for a period. Because I can assure you, if any of us in the room had a terrorist incident or one of our loved ones died and the police came to you and said, love to help you, but we just can't get access to that app because we can't, because the Australians didn't want it and we don't have legislation that allows it. I'm pretty certain that everyone would want to change their minds under that point. So yes, I'm all in favour of it as long as it's proportionate and the balances privacy and security.
Do you want to come in on the third question on workforce?
Look, I agree with Jeremy. I don't really have anything to add there other than in my CRC we are doing a lot of work with our students who do work on both and long and research projects that do actually cover industrial control systems and cybersecurity. So hopefully that will be the workforce of the future where we have sort of both disciplines coming into one.
Last word for you, Rajiv.
So starting off with the standards, I actually agree with what Rachel said earlier on. You have to be careful with standards, and you actually see in the report that they can be a two-edged sword. But the important thing is if we can get the right standards to give people guidance, they're not an end in themselves, but they're a part of that. In terms of the enforcement, I think you're right, it needs to have a bite to it. I'm in two minds around the financial penalties, because you see two things happen with financial penalties. Firstly, you get people that say, well, it's a cost of doing business. And you look at those examples with the unions in this country. There are some unions that decide it's worth paying the fines in order to break the law. At the other end of the extreme, you get things like GDPR, which actually causes disproportionate. How many emails have you all received in the last year saying, for GDPR, we need you to confirm what emails you want to receive from us. It's like I get spam because of GDPR. And therefore what it does is it upsets that what you want is a sensible risk-benefit trade-off. And suddenly there's this big number flashing at people and it forces them to do things that are out of proportion. But it does have to have bite to it. So I take that. And I think, an interesting example is the telecommunications, the TSSR, telecommunications security regulations that have come in, which actually put, coming back to this one of the points that comes later on, telecommunications is a key part of critical infrastructure. And there the government said this is so important that actually if it need be, the government needs the power to go and direct a company and compel them to take certain action because that's what is required to secure that infrastructure. We'll answer that one. Talking about the education, I think one of the key things about education is I think we need to start getting away from the stovepipes. You don't go and learn one trade and do that for the rest of your life. To be honest, that's long since gone. I often use the example, I did a PhD in quantum physics, and notwithstanding we now talk about quantum encryption, I sort of said, well, I stopped doing that and I went into something completely different. What I had to do is keep on learning, keep on adapting through my career. And therefore I think that, making better use of on-the-job learning and breaking down barriers between disciplines is the way to get that workforce and that skills that we need. Because the other thing is that whatever you learn now in order to secure an OT system, I guarantee to you in 10 years' time, that will be completely useless. You've got to keep on adapting and improving. What's that? Between everyone and canapes, I'll be very quick on the last one. I agree with what Rachel said. There's well-established legislation around telecommunications interception and over-the-top providers. I don't see why that should be any different. That said, I'm probably the least qualified person in the room because I'm probably the only person who doesn't regularly use Facebook, so maybe I shouldn't talk too much about social media.
All right, thank you very much. It is canapes and drinks time. Thank you very much again to Thales Australia for the support of this project. Thank you for you to coming out in the depths of winter to join us. And thank you very much to our panel. Let's give them a round of applause.